Thank you very much. So, first of all, thanks to Hilda, to Janet and people for the invitation. Somebody tweeted this during the week and I responded saying it's a privilege to be here. And it wasn't a throwaway comment, it is a privilege to be here. I'm very humbled to be in the kind of company of people who walk the walk while I talk the talk. So thank you very much for allowing me to come and speak to you today. I'm going to talk about Grenfell, the social murder. In fact, I'm going to talk about Grenfell and how we might look at it in different ways. There's perhaps an obvious question, why Grenfell? Maybe there isn't, but I mean, obvious question, why Grenfell perhaps? Firstly, Grenfell was a site of people's homes, of course, as we know. But it was also a site where people died because of work, I think because of work-related fatalities. It was also a site, it had been a construction site in many respects. It was still a construction site at the time of the killing. It's also a place, of course, where firefighters and other emergency service workers risked their lives. So it falls squarely within the ambit of work. Secondly, why Grenfell? Grenfell because it's kind of exceptional, but actually Grenfell's very normal. If you take Louise's whole story, the figures she referred to, 50,000 workers and work-related fatalities each year, that's 2 Grenfells a fucking day. 2 Grenfells a day, remember that, comrades, right? 2 Grenfells a day. Grenfell is exceptional, but it's normal. Grenfell is twice tomorrow, twice Sunday, twice Monday, twice Tuesday, and so on and so forth. So it's normal. Grenfell is normal. Thirdly, of course, Grenfell is a symbol. It's a symbol of a common set of processes and concerns. Things we know all too well, things we'll spend a lot of time talking about at this conference, about deregulation. Grenfell is a symbol of deregulation. It's a symbol of non-enforcement of law, of austerity, of cuts. And most of all, I think, Grenfell is a symbol of class and ethnic contempt. Now, one way in which we can think about Grenfell is as a crime. I'm a criminologist, or I'm now called a criminologist, right? I never studied criminology in my life. There's a very famous book by an American criminologist called Jeffrey Ryman, very old, it's in about 14th edition now. It's a good book, but it's got a fantastic title. The title of the book is The Rich Get Richer, The Poor Get Prison. And that's illustrated in the case of Grenfell very clearly. Is Grenfell a crime? Well, yes, it clearly is. You may not recognise these names, but these are the people who have been prosecuted so far for crimes related to Grenfell. Of those 7 people, 6 of them have been prosecuted for various forms of fraud associated with the fallout from the fire. And one, Eamon Zada, a resident of Grenfell Tower, has been convicted, successfully prosecuted, because police found what they called a cannabis resin factory in his flat. These people have all gone down as a result of what happened. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't have, right? But these are the poor who got prison. If I showed you their faces, you'd see something else about these people. None of them look very Anglo-Saxon. None of them are white, right? None of them are white. Elaine Douglas and Tommy Brooks, who sound a bit white, are Jamaican nationals. Okay? So the rich and the black get prison. There may also be a case of corporate manslaughter, corporate homicide. In fact, the Met announced within a few months of the fire that they would collect collating evidence in order to possibly pass over charges cases to the CPS. In the dock, according to the Met, according to Cressida Vick, are the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea Council, the Kensington and Chelsea TMO, which ran social housing in the borough, which ran the block of flats on behalf of the council, and also Ryden as the main contractor, and about 8 or 9 other contractors. There are about 50 to 60 companies who worked on the refurbishment, which proved so fatal for 72 of the residents on that night, 14th of June 2017. Now, it may or may not be the case that there is a kind of prosecution that follows under this Act. To date, since 2007, 50,000 deaths every year. Since 2007, since that Act was brought in to bring large companies to account for corporate killing, there have been 26 successful prosecutions, 26 successful prosecutions, 50,000 deaths every year. Not one of those prosecutions has been against a large company. The chances of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea or TMO being successfully prosecuted, I would suggest, are relatively small, but who knows? The police are working through 35 million documents in order to consider a case. They've got through about 100,000 so far, so don't hold your breath. There may very likely be successful prosecution under health and safety fire legislation. The Lacanau fire in 2009 in Southwark, very, very similar in many respects, chillingly similar to what happened at Grenfell Tower 8 years later, resulted of the CPS considered charged with corporate manslaughter in 2012, decided it wasn't the case that would succeed in court. In 2015, charges successfully were brought against Southwark Borough Council under fire safety legislation. That council was fined £570,000. Of course, the only income that councils have is from council taxpayers, or most of the income is from council taxpayers. And the people who can least afford to pay more council tax are the poorest taxpayers who depend upon the services provided by that council. So the fine levied upon Southwark Borough Council will most likely hit hardest those who can least afford to pay. That's a very likely outcome, at least. If there is a corporate manslaughter prosecution, who knows? That's a very likely outcome, at least in the case of Grenfell. So Grenfell is a crime in many respects. It's also, of course, a source of harm, and I've been collating this stuff for the last year or so, going up and down the country talking about this. I think it's important that somebody does it. Other people are doing bits of this. I think it's important that somebody does this. Grenfell's a source of various forms of harm. Some of them are very obvious, some of them are less obvious. It's a source of physical harm. 72 people died that night, according to official figures. There were various forms of injuries, not burns actually, because most people who came into contact with the fire were so hot were killed. Right? No, aren't lasting injuries from burns. Most lasting injuries are from forms of concussion or fractures of limbs, legs, arms, and damage to heads as people trying to get out of the building, falling over dead bodies, other people trying to get out where there was smoke and no light. Asbestos was released that night, we know. Hydrogen cyanide was released that night, we know, and we don't know the effects, well, we do know the effects of those who expose those in the long term, but of course no one will be carrying those effects in the long term. We also know that there are a whole series of emotional and psychological harms associated with what happened that night. Obviously, the kind of the loss, the trauma, the loss of family, the loss of friends, the loss of pets, the loss of possessions, things that can't be replaced, the guilt at surviving, we know that there have been a whole series of psychological traumas associated with what happened that night. We know there have been attempts. Within 3 months, it was claimed there were 20 suicide attempts from those people who survived the fire or local residents in the wider Lancaster West estate. A whole series of illnesses such as PTSD, depression, anxiety, so on and so forth. Substance dependency is claimed has increased in the area, and one would imagine that to be the case, of course. It's unimaginable what people in that area have been through, not least given the fact that they still visibly have to see the tower in their midst, day in, day out. There are a whole series of cultural harms associated with what happened that night. Former residents and survivors have experienced harms by having their ways of living disturbed or literally removed, because of course they've been displaced. People who were in the tower have been moved elsewhere. So cultural harms have been produced from people's physical relocation. People have lost their social networks, their mutual supports, their common experiences, the small things which make a life worth living. They no longer see the people they know or recognise on the walk, the bus or the tube to work or school. They no longer see the people they used to see in the local shops. They don't see the people they want to normally see in the park, the cafe or the pub. They've lost those aspects of the daily lives which make people's daily lives at a time when they needed them most. And no one talks about the kinds of harms produced by the loss of accustomed modes of living. There have also been a whole series of financial and economic harms. So individuals associated with loss in the fire, those people dislocated, experienced financial harms, but there have also been economic harms experienced by the local council, harms experienced by central government in terms of the public inquiry, and harms experienced, of course, by local authorities up and down the country who suddenly realise that they also have residents in tower blocks with flammable cladding, about which they've made promises they'll remove, but find out they've got fuck all money to remove it. Now, eventually, the cladding will be removed. Eventually, the public inquiry will finish. Eventually, fines will be levied. But the economy as a whole, and those people who rely upon state goods and services as a whole, will pay most for those expenditures. It won't be the rich people in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea who wanted the residents of Grenfell Tower displaced. There'll be people like us and the people with whom we work on a daily basis. So a whole series of economic harms which will affect communities up and down this country for many years to come. Lastly, and I think most seriously, there are harms of, this is a bit of a kind of poncy social scientific word, recognition. Harms in recognition. Really what this means is the fact that the people in Grenfell Tower have been systematically treated with contempt. There was contempt which meant that our obvious concerns, that prediction about what would happen to them, KCTMO playing with fire, the Grenfell Action Group logged in November 2016, which predicted the fire. It was contempt which meant their voices were never listened to. And contempt characterises the way in which the survivors and the local community have been treated since. How devastating must it be for those people who survived the fire to know that their friends and families lost their lives in the richest borough in England, a borough which sold 2 council houses for £4.6 million in 2016. The people lost their lives in that borough so that the contractor could save £293,000 on more combustible cladding. £293,000. How does one get over that level of contempt? But the contempt has been reproduced on a daily and weekly basis since the disaster. The fact that the local estate was absent in the days and weeks on the estate. On the estate, people survived through self-help. Theresa May even Theresa fucking May said, 9 days after the disaster, in Parliament, she apologised for the absence of the local and national state at the time when people needed them most. End of quote. But she and her government continued to treat the residents with contempt. She told those people displaced, quote, every person made homeless would receive an offer of accommodation within 3 weeks. That was very quickly clarified by Sally Jabbit as meaning an offer of temporary accommodation. But 1 year after the fire, in June 2018, just a month ago, 82 of the 203 households who needed rehousing were in permanent accommodation. 2/3 of those were still not in permanent accommodation. 1/3 of those were still in emergency accommodation, by which I mean bed and breakfast or hotel accommodation. There's many other examples of contempt in terms of the way in which the inquiry is set up and so on and so forth, but the residents of Grenfell have been treated and continue to be treated with contempt. The third way in which we can see Grenfell is as the outcome of a long-term and sustained attack on regulation. I won't talk about this, it's getting late in the night. You know this as well or better than I do. The mutually supportive attack on the idea of regulation through the rhetoric, through the institutions set up around government to stop regulation, through legal reform designed to undermine regulation, through consistent reforms of regulators and regulation, consistent reviews. I can't think of any other government function in this country which has been reviewed more in the last 15 years than health and safety regulation. Can't think of anything, actually. And as well as an attack on regulation, Grenfell can be understood as an attack on enforcement. Now, I've been doing work, some of you may know, for looking at enforcement trends from 2005, which was under New Labour. It's a particular watershed when New Labour introduced something called better regulation, which we all knew was going to be worse regulation, and indeed it was. It meant a significant downturn in all forms of enforcement. But what one finds during this period is consistent downturns in, for example, these are just inspections, right? So health and safety inspections down since 2010, which marks the start of austerity. Food safety inspections down, pollution control inspections down. And what a fucking surprise, fire safety inspections down as well. And one could add any other inspectorial arm of the state designed to deliver social protection. Our last point about social protection wasn't a slip, because there's another way of thinking about regulation, of course. That's thinking about regulation not as red tape, not as rules to be obeyed, but as social protection. Where did regulation come from? In fact, regulation first emerged in the 1830s in this country to control the worst effects of industrial capitalism. The first regulation, the first laws to interfere with companies anywhere on this earth were to do with health and safety in the UK, eventually become the Factories Act in the 1830s. then control of pollution, then control of adulterated food, and then a whole raft of regulation follows. Fought for by working men and women, not gifted by the government, of course. These were forms of social protection to prevent death, to prevent illness, to prevent immiseration, to prevent injury. So if a government or governments or set of institutions starts dismantling a system of social protection, it must know that death will thereby be produced. And if a government or set of institutions undertakes that dismantling, knowing that death will be produced, then it's fair to point, I think, to state or social murder. Social murder was a coined term by an old friend of mine, and maybe some of yours, a guy called Friedrich Engels, who was a good mate of Karl Marx. And the term social murder was first coined in a book that Engels wrote in 1845 when he surveyed what he called, quote, the condition of the working class in Manchester. And he talked about working class people dying systematically because of the lack of state intervention. And it's very clear. When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, such injury that death results, we call that deed manslaughter. When you say that knew in advance the injury would be fatal, we call this deed murder, intention, right? But when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position, they must inevitably meet eternal death. Places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them to remain in such conditions until that death ensures, which is the inevitable consequence. And they're the conditions in which the people of Grenfell live, because they predicted their own death months before it happened. Knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain. This deed is murder, just as surely as the deed of a single individual. So we should characterise such deaths as social murder, says Engels, and I think he's quite right. Grenfell is a crime of a whole series of ways. Grenfell has produced a whole series of harms which will affect people for the rest of their lives, not just in that community, but will have ripple effects throughout communities, marginalised communities, in tower blocks, across the country and perhaps across the world. So it's a crime and a harm as well, but it's also a social murder. And unless we fight for our own social protection, Grenfell will be repeated up and down the country. So justice for Grenfell, remember the dead, fight for the living. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Steve. For those of you who, this is the first conference you've been at, Steve's spoken at this conference a few times, and he's always very concise and very powerful in the message that he puts across.